All right, so let's dive right in. Today we're looking at retired L-Team General Keith Kellogg's proposed peace plan for the war in Ukraine. Definitely seems to be generating a lot of buzz, especially with everything else going on.
Oh, absolutely. Zelensky's comments on NATO and the Pentagon's new aid package. It's a very charged atmosphere right now.
Yeah, no kidding. And right into that atmosphere walks Kellogg,
Right.
a familiar face from the Trump administration, back in the spotlight now as Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. He put this plan forward with Fred flights back in April of 2024. And the whole thing is built on this peace through strength idea that the U.S. can use its influence to end the war, but without, losing sight of its own interests.
Kellogg insists that this isn't isolationism, though.
Right.
He frames it as a break from what he calls the foreign policy establishment, although he doesn't really say who exactly that includes. It's interesting because it raises the question, is this actually a new approach or just a repackaging of familiar ideas with a different label?
That's a great question. And it's one we'll definitely be unpacking as we go deeper. So let's get into the specifics. What exactly does Kellogg's plan propose? What are we actually looking at here?
Well, at its heart, the plan aims to get both sides to the negotiating table by establishing a ceasefire, which is a tall order considering the intensity of the fighting, but it's the foundation upon which the rest of the plan hinges.
Okay. So ceasefire negotiations, that's the starting point. But what are the incentives for each side to actually agree to this? What's the carrot?
Well, for Russia, there's the promise of some pretty significant concessions.
Mhm.
First, Kellogg proposes a delay on any discussion of Ukraine joining NATO, potentially for as long as 10 years. This directly addresses one of Russia's major stated concerns about NATO expansion.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
And it gets even more controversial when we look at what the plan says about the territories that Russia currently occupies in Ukraine.
Yeah, this is where the plan really starts to generate debate.
Yeah.
It suggests that Russia would retain control of those territories. It's a major sticking point because it essentially rewards Russia for its aggression, and it raises serious questions about whether it's a sustainable solution in the long term.
Yeah.
Does it set a dangerous precedent?
It does feel like a tough pill to swallow,
Now,
especially for Ukraine.
yeah, it does. But let's not forget the plan also includes the potential for sanctions relief,
Right.
partial relief to begin with, and full relief if Russia agrees to a deal that's acceptable to Ukraine. So there's that.
It is interesting, though, because the plan doesn't really go into specifics about which sanctions would be lifted or, the mechanisms for doing so. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation, which could either be strategic or just a lack of clarity.
Yeah, good point. There's definitely some ambiguity there. But for now, let's shift our focus to Ukraine. What incentives does the plan offer them? What are they getting out of this? Well beyond the potential for a ceasefire and the economic benefits of sanctions relief, the plan does outline continued military support for Ukraine, possibly in the form of interest-free loans. Though, like the sanctions relief, the details on this are a bit vague.
So more weapons, but maybe with an IOU attached?
Essentially, yeah. And there's also an economic angle. The plan proposes tariffs on Russian energy exports, with those funds being used to finance Ukraine's reconstruction.
Okay, so hit Russia's economy, but then use the proceeds to help rebuild Ukraine. I can see the logic there, though it does depend on how effective those tariffs would actually be. But let's go back to Russia for a second. What's in it for them beyond just keeping the territory they've already taken? Is it just about the land grab?
Well, we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The plan seems to be aiming at something beyond just a ceasefire. It's dangling the possibility of ending Russia's political isolation on the world stage, restarting diplomatic channels, easing tensions with both the U.S. and NATO.
Okay, so a potential path back to being accepted by the international community. Interesting. But you're the one who really sees the chessboard here. Help me understand how all of this fits into the broader context of the war. Where does this plan fit in?
Well, what's fascinating is that Kellogg's plan kind of throws a wrench into an already complex debate. It's not just about ending the fighting. It's about how to balance diplomacy with security guarantees and territorial integrity in the midst of a war that's shattered so many norms.
Yeah, and it forces us to grapple with true. So it's not a complete surrender to Russia's wish list, but it's still a huge VE departure from the current approach, and it's sparking a lot of debate, especially in light of Zelensky's recent comments. He's been incredibly clear. No recognition of annexations, diplomacy over ceding land, and he wants NATO protection for any territory that remains free.
It's a very different approach, and it highlights the fundamental tension at the heart of this conflict. The tension between finding a negotiated solution that acknowledges the reality on the ground and upholding the principle of territorial integrity.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. But we have to try to find some way forward. So for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this, let's try to distill the key takeaways. What are the big things to remember here?
If I were to summarize Kellogg's plan in a nutshell, it's this. He's aiming for peace, but it comes at a very high price for Ukraine. And there are huge questions about whether it's actually viable in the long term. Is this just kicking the can down the road?
Yeah. And it's a stark contrast to Zelensky's approach, which, as we've discussed, is centered on NATO's role and a refusal to concede territory. So ultimately, where does this leave us? What are the potential implications of Kellogg's plan, and how might it impact the future of the conflict?
Well, it's hard to say with any certainty,
Yeah.
but I think it's safe to say that Kellogg's plan, whether it gains traction or not, has added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. It's injected a new set of variables into the equation, and it's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the limits of diplomacy and the difficult choices that lie ahead.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those situations where there are no easy answers. It requires careful consideration of all the factors at play, the potential consequences, and the long-term implications. It does, right? No easy answers. But as you said, it's about acknowledging that complexity. And for our listeners, I think one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole situation is how differently these key players see the path to peace. Like Kellogg's plan is all about finding a compromise, even if it means making some, difficult concessions. But Zelenskyy seems to be holding firm to a very different set of principles.
Absolutely. Zelensky's focus is on security for Ukraine and its territorial integrity, and he sees NATO membership as the most viable way to achieve that. He's made it clear that he's not willing to negotiate away Ukraine's sovereignty, even if it means a longer conflict.
And that contrast, I think, really gets to the heart of the dilemma here, right? Is it possible to achieve a lasting peace through compromise? Or does true security require a different kind of commitment? Maybe even a willingness to take on more risk?
It's a question that has no easy answer. And it's a question that goes beyond just the conflict in Ukraine. It speaks to the broader challenges of international relations, the shifting balance of power, and the ongoing struggle to find ways to prevent and resolve conflicts in a world that seems increasingly volatile.
Yeah, for sure. We've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder, something to really chew on, given everything we've discussed. What do you think is the most difficult aspect of achieving a lasting peace in Ukraine? Is it the territorial disputes, the security guarantees, the deep mistrust that exists between the parties involved, or something else entirely?
It's a question worth grappling with,
Yeah.
because ultimately the path to peace, however difficult, requires us to understand the complexities, the competing interests, and the very human cost of this conflict.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it's giving you some new perspectives on this incredibly important issue. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.